co-chair of a task force of the UN Millennium Project. Actually, the task force is a Science, Technology and Innovation Task Force. So the task force report, you can download it from this link. So our task force actually was convened by Kofi Annan under Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Our task force, the STI task force, we recommend that for developing country, you must take 2 steps. First is build inclusive and comprehensive infrastructure. And this infrastructure is everything, not just hard roads and bridges and all, but ICT, housing, educational facilities and all that. But coupled with that, you must actually build small and medium enterprises in your own country, because they are those that provide employment for the young people. Now the MDGs will be replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals, which will be next year, starting next year, 2016 to the year 2030. And you see that there are 17 goals. I just list them out for you, and they are very comprehensive, the goals. So there's a link that you can actually download and look at the goals. But not only there are 17 goals, but there are also 169 targets that is associated with each of the goals, not in all, 169 in all. So the SDGs are very comprehensive. It addresses all the problems of poverty, disease, health, and everything else. And it is actually, for the developing country, it is a recipe, a menu for developing country to follow. You pick your priority and try to achieve the SDGs by 2030. But the most important thing about the SDG is that it boldly proclaims the end of poverty by global poverty by 2030. Now the definition of global poverty now, the line is those living below 1.25 US dollars a day. That below that line is the absolute poor. But if the SDG said that the world can actually eradicate the absolute poor by 2030. So this is, to me, a very hopeful message. Now, the transformation from the silo-like and government-centric MDG to the very comprehensive SDGs, to me, is because of the dramatic rise of the South. So I actually basically think that the most striking examples of this rise of the South, of course, is China, the Asian tigers, and also ASEAN countries like Malaysia, Singapore, and others, which are in the Asia-Pacific region. So I myself think that South-South cooperation for achieving the SDGs will be through like BRICS institutions, like the BRICS Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and regional economies, that economic community, which are in the South, like ASEAN, like the East African Economic Community, the West African Economic Community, and the Mercosur in South America. And they will be the principal engines for South countries to achieve the SDGs. Actually, of particular relevance to my talk this morning is actually the SDG number 9. Build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. I would like to actually stress that infrastructure, the development, is linked to industrialization through the SMEs, and also innovation, which are through the SMEs in your own country, you see. So I think as an engineer, I'm very encouraged that it is now universally accepted that infrastructure development is the foundation for economic and social development of any country, particularly a developing country. But I would like you to note that in all the discussion and the consultation that arrived at the 17 SDGs, there is no mention, although it mentioned about the importance of infrastructure development, there's no mention of the need to maintain the infrastructure system, installations and facilities in good repair and working order. The industry that is, of course, intimately connected with infrastructure development is the construction industry. So I want to guide you through the construction industry. The first, of course, is the global outlook. And this one, I took the statistics actually from a UK government report. See, so you can download this. But the government report in UK suggests that, you know, the global construction market will grow by 70% by 2025. And the global construction industry is set to grow at 4.3% per annum until 2025. And it will be concentrated in emerging economy, basically South countries. This one, I obtained it from a US database. And you can see that the construction industry is actually a great part of the GDP. You can see that it used to be before the global financial crisis, the construction is 9% of GDP. That say 2006. But because of global financial crisis, it has gone down to 5% of the GDP in 2011. In 2012, the global GDP amounted to about 72.6 trillion US dollars. So if we take the forecast of the UK government report that the construction will grow at 4.3%, then the annual turnover will still be 3.1 trillion US dollars a year until 2025, according to the UK forecast. And I think that UK is not alone among countries to want to get a slice of this very juicy construction pie. The construction outlook in the developed world. I want to say that the developed world had turned away from the construction manufacturing, the hard aspects of economic growth, to service industry. And a lot of their own infrastructure has been sold, whether it's companies like Westinghouse, which is a very famous company in the electric power industry, and then like utilities like in UK, water, electric power has been broken up and sold to foreign concerns, you see. So I feel that without the support of their manufacturing base, they cannot compete in the overseas construction market against giants like the Chinese. In the developed world, their infrastructure is very old and also in need of modernization, in need of renewal. But the developed countries suffer from what I call a suffix of democracy. Too democratic. So every infrastructure project is subject to repeated public hearing. And you know what's the result? The result is they delay the project because they don't want it in my own backyard. So many projects are delayed many times, and then the capital costs increase and many times. And the other thing, of course, is that their governments are short-term. They are subject to repeated elections. I think this is relevant that you are having the elections here today. And so they've got many twists and turns on investment investment on infrastructure. Infrastructure projects, as a government change, is delayed or abandoned, and then the next government comes along and then it's resurrected. So I think that because of this, I think that the infrastructure development in the developed world will have to depend on construction companies and cooperation from the developing world, especially China. As a striking example, President Obama, for this year's U.S. budget of $4 trillion US dollars, he wants to devote actually merely 478 billion on transportation and infrastructure over 6 years. But according to the New York Times, because both houses of Congress are now controlled by Republicans, and President Obama wants to raise taxes on the rich for infrastructure development, it will not be able to pass the Congress for this. Now, I want to now talk about construction outlook in China and in Asia. I think there's no doubt that in global construction, the country that bestrides the world like a colossus is China. And as an industry, because if you can see that at the annual turnover, if it's 3.1 trillion, then 10%, we said 10% of the total should be set aside for infrastructure maintenance. And it is actually 310 billion. But taking the average infrastructure asset life as 25 years, the annual global budget for maintenance infrastructure would be some 12 billion. It is actually a very sizable service, professional service, what you call the industry, if we take it as such. So ISTIC, I want just to mention ISTIC. The ISTIC, then we have this maintenance of infrastructure as our priority program, you see. So we have actually conducted this maintenance of infrastructure workshop in India, Kenya, Myanmar, Nigeria, and Malaysia. But then closely associated with this infrastructure of maintenance, it is this accreditation of engineering and technological education qualification to international standard. Firstly, in Asia and the Pacific, and this one we are working with UNESCO to try to get UNESCO to adopt the standard and then apply it to all universities and technical colleges, so that it gives the quality of education more or less international standard. And if this is accepted, it will lead to mobility of engineers and technicians across the region. So what I have tried to advocate now is Malaysia to be a regional center for training of engineers and technicians in the maintenance of infrastructure. And this is also for Malaysia, but also for the rest of the developing countries to South-South cooperation. And then because I think that a lot of developing countries from Africa and Latin America, they look to Malaysia as a good model to, for economic and social development, okay? And so I'm now having support from all the Malaysian professional bodies who are engaged in human capital development in infrastructure and construction to set up this regional center for South-South cooperation in this. And then I also urge them that the Malaysian service providers in infrastructure maintenance, they should actually go overseas and mentor to set up similar service providers in other South countries. So for this one, we need the help of government. But I'm trying to get this going, because I told them that if they are able to help the other countries like African country, to have their service provider in infrastructure maintenance, then you actually build up a cohort of alumni of Malaysia. And this will actually have enable Malaysia to have friends in high places later on in Africa to help us get the infrastructure projects in Africa. But finally, I want to just mention the role of universities. I think that the established universities, traditional universities, they are not able to train people in infrastructure maintenance because they are after R&D and go up in ranking, in university ranking in the world, and then through publication and citation. So I think maybe the private university like Future University Sudan, they can take up this continuing professional development in infrastructure, and then not only do a service for the country like Sudan, but also it is, I think, can be a very profitable, for the university concern. Thank you very much.
IAP with Bruce Alberts in the United States. He's the co-chair of that IAP, still, very active. But I think always I remember Professor Hassan. Whenever I see him, I see twice. Professor Hassan worked closely with the Nobel laureate Professor Abdus Salam for years in creating TWAS. He is a co-creator with Abdus Salam, the World Academy of Sciences, and he was the executive director. And this is where I met Professor Hassan, and from that time until now, that's for decades, we're still colleagues, good friends, and whenever I look at him, I look to the history and the establishment and the creation of a world-class academy, TWAS, the World Academy of Science. Professor Hassan will moderate, will make comments. He has all the time from now until lunch to invite interventions, questions, and comments from the floor. Professor Hassan.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Professor Badran, for chairing this edition of the Future University Forum. Many of you might, I'm sure Professor Badran doesn't need any introduction, but many of you might not know that I regard him as my mentor, together with Abdus Salam. And when he was in UNESCO, particularly when he was ADG Science, and then he became the Deputy Director General of UNESCO, I was working with TWAS, but TWAS was under UNESCO, so he was my boss when I was interested. And not only me, he also mentored Mustafa, Tayyib Mustafa, and Riyaz Baidul was his student. So the three of us, we thank you very much for this excellent mentorship. And I'm sure that you all agree that he did a good job there. Huh? Okay, well, as Professor Badran mentioned, these three lectures are extremely fascinating, really. First, Farouk told us how space technology, space science, and space imagery in particular can be used very fruitfully to explore the resources of the earth, especially underground. And he picked the example of water resources. So I just wanted to mention here that this is not just a matter of looking at the data that you receive from satellites, because anybody can look at the data, but it is how you interpret the data. That requires a particular expertise like Farouk Al-Baz to tell us whether that area has got water or not water. So this is a requirement that is quite unique, I think, and not many people have this talent and expertise to explain the data itself that we receive from satellites. But then Alec took us away from Earth. He launched us into space. The space of galaxies, of stars, of dark matter. And that was quite fascinating journey. And after that journey, that really brought us back to Earth. But this time, not underground, but on the surface. And he told us how infrastructure is so important and vital to address some of the very critical challenges that are highlighted by the Sustainable Development Goals, especially Sustainable Development Goal number 9, that deals specifically with infrastructure. So these are really 3 very fascinating lectures, and we thank the 3 of them for that. Well, we're going to have questions and answers. I think we might have about half an hour. Is that correct? Yeah. But let me just begin by asking a question to each of our 3 speakers. Just a very brief question. First, Farouk, I think what you have said about the radiation index and the aridity of the deserts, this is really quite frightening. But the question is, can this huge area, this vast arid area, can it be utilized to solve particular problems? And in fact, that has already been done in a number of countries, using the desert to generate electricity from the sun. Because there we experience something like 3,000 to 4,000 hours per year of continuous sunshine. So how you can transform this into solar energy and use it for various purposes, I think this is something that's very challenging. And I would like you at least to comment on some of the projects that have recently been initiated, especially by Morocco. Morocco is now planning to produce at least 2,000 megawatts per year from solar energy by the year 2020. And this is quite substantial. I think it will meet at least 20% of the energy requirement of Morocco. And they are aiming for something bigger. They are even aiming to join desert tech and move electricity to Europe, solar electricity to Europe. So I think comment on that.
Is it?
Will be quite good. For Alec, should we answer first? I thought maybe I should mention the 3 questions, and then after that we'll ask the floor to ask questions. Alec, the experience that you have explained to us about dark matter and dark energy is very fascinating. But very recently, many of you might know that CERN, the experiment, the large hydrogen, the large collider, what's it called? The large
accelerator.
Yeah, the large HLC. Yeah, and I don't know what H stands for, but C is for collider. They have just recently doubled the energy. Which means that they're going to see more fascinating stuff apart from the Higgs particle that has already been done. But Alec, are they going to detect dark matter or dark energy? This is quite fascinating if they can manage to do that. So that's a question for Alec. For Yi Chong, thank you very much for all this experience that you have explained about China and China infrastructure. But I would really like you to tell us more about the infrastructure vis-a-vis impact on climate change. Because many people tend to think that for Africa it's better to look for green infrastructure, green energy and green infrastructure. And I think what you have explained about China is very fascinating. But can we learn some of the lessons that the Chinese